Well, good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, according to your time zone. And welcome to the Courtauld and to Afrotropes and Art History's Global Imagination, which promises to be an outstanding event. My name is David Corbett. I'm the director of the Centre for American Art here at the Courtauld, and we're hosting this event. I hope many of you are frequent visitors to the programme of conferences, lectures, symposia, and other events the Centre puts on. You can find everything listed under the Research tab from the Courtauld's landing page. And I'd like to welcome all of the fantastic speakers who are lined up today, and it's a particular pleasure to welcome Professor Huey Copeland and Professor Krista Thompson. Afrotropes is organised by Dr. Sarah Hegenbart of the Technical University of Munich and Dr. Levi Prombaum of the Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art. And I'm now going to turn over to Sarah and Levi to introduce the event in detail.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on wherever you are. I'm Sarah Hegenbart, and now Levi.
Sorry, everyone, just getting this presentation set up. And I'm Levi Prombaum, and we are the co-organizers of this Day of Exchanges devoted to the Afrotrope, an analytic framework introduced by Huey Copeland and Krista Thompson that examines the circulation of motifs that feature centrally in African diaspora aesthetics, and which raises a number of exciting questions around the transmission, translation, and transformation of images and image cultures within and beyond the African diaspora. We have the great honor of being joined today by Dr. Copeland and Dr. Thompson, who have generously offered their guidance and support over this last year, helping us to assemble a fantastic group of scholars and artists who will share their perspectives about the potentials of Afrotropic inquiry. A smaller conference was originally planned for March of 2020, and its pandemic-related delay has resulted in this great virtual gathering a year later. So we want to extend our deepest thanks to Huey and Krista, as well as to David and the Research Forum at the Center for American Art at the Courtauld, and finally to our speakers, to Janine Francois, Meleko Magosi, Alvin Zabunyan, Danvir Singh Brar, Evan Ifekoya, Blue Curry, Amy Mooney, Julia Smith, and Kader Atia for making this gathering possible. Even with the limitations of virtual space that we're all a little too familiar with by this spring, we're grateful to our contributors for bringing their experience and their expertise to bear on these emerging art historical and art critical conversations, and for doing so amidst the social crises and tragedies of our moment.
Our discussion about the Afrotropes started in New York in early 2018, when I was visiting Levi during the CAA conference. While preparing soup together, Levi introduced me to the notion of the Afrotrope, and we directly delved into a long conversation. Since we had started our doctoral research at the Courtauld in 2013, we noticed numerous overlaps, crossings, and shared interests among our research projects. While Levi focused on the racial operations at play in different mid-20th century American modernisms, I examined a participatory art project which was provocatively titled Opera Village Africa in Burkina Faso, which was initiated by the late multimedia artist Christoph Schlingensief. Our doctoral research in different ways contributed to an increasing questioning of the dominance of Western historiography in art history, and we wondered how history could be rewritten in a way that it's not prescribed by the violent perspectives of white supremacy. When we spoke about Afrotropic inquiry to each other, including its sensitivity to the movement of figures across time and space, its attention to the materiality and density of images, its intervention into the study of circulation with considerations of diasporic belonging, and its vibrant conceptual underpinnings reaching across Mikhail Bakhtin and Paul Gilory, T.J. Clark and James Mead, Henry Louis Gates Jr. and Hortense Spillers, to name but a few important touch points, we had a forum to think together about our objects of study and about the goals of our scholarship. So we hope to continue these conversations today with a group that we have assembled on the basis of being really excited to hear them, to hear from them, and to learn from them. As two white scholars who have benefited from numerous privileges informed by white supremacist culture, and as scholars who have been able to work on our projects with the support of institutions who are only beginning to reckon with their own relationships to ongoing histories and presence of colonialism and anti-Blackness, we are dedicated to raising awareness about how white supremacy shapes our thinking and our lives. We strongly believe that fighting against white supremacist thinking and white privilege within art historical production is not the task of those who suffer most from it, but of white scholars who need to actively work on rebuilding the material and epistemological structures of the institutions of which we are part, with the transformative work of Black scholars and scholars of color at the center. As young scholars, we are extremely excited that we have the opportunity today to listen to scholars and artists who have not only fundamentally inspired us, but whose work massively contributes to shifting perspectives in art research and practice towards a more global imagination and global historiography. Afrotropes play a crucial role in this process. According to Caroline Levin, studies of migration and diaspora, transnational trade routes, contact zones, and traveling cultures have recently emphasized the network's capacity to travel or crack open bounded totalities. In this manner, the Afrotrope operates against a form of Western historiography which marginalizes or even excludes the history of the global South. It provides, quote, a vital heuristic to reveal that which remains unknown or cast out of the visual field. While the Afrotrope as a form can remain latent for a period of time, social action, community building, and the formation of novel networks can provide, quote, the right set of circumstances for the Afrotrope to come into visibility. Copeland and Thompson describes the emergence of Afrotropes as follows, quote, Afrotropes do not simply recur over time, but materialize and are about time. Its passage and return, its negotiation or reconfiguration by African diasporic subjects. Indeed, these forms often appear communally authored, claimed or selected, circulating in variously traceable networks and routes. Afrotropes have emerged or waited, quickened or slowed their pace of dissemination, often in response to circumstances that prevent them from taking shape or hinder the circulation. As such, they give form to that which has remained at times unspoken and unseen, enabling a fresh consideration of what is repressed or absented within the visual archive. The Afrotrope, therefore, contributes to a type of mnemonic aesthetics, as Cheryl Finley labels the practice of remembering as a creative strategy. My current research explores how the Afrotrope recurs in contemporary art practice in the Black diaspora. Currently, I'm utilizing the analytical framework of the Afrotrope as a point of departure to analyze a variety of artistic positions from the Black diaspora against the backdrop of their potential to intervene in process of Western history writing. Meleko Mokosi, for example, utilizes Afrotropes in his translation of the genre of history painting to the contemporary experience of life in the Black diaspora. Mokosi completed his 6-year project, Democratic Intuition, comprising 8 different chapters in 2019. My suspicion is that Democratic Intuition, the title, is a reference to Spivak's notion of intuition of democracy, anticipated a crisis of democracy before the symptoms of this crisis could be experienced in the global north. I'm particularly interested in how artists in the Black diaspora challenge conventional artistic genres, for example, history, landscape, and genre painting, by confronting them with what they left out, for example, the material manifestations of Black history. In doing so, I critically explore the recent phenomenon of so-called post-truth. I suspect that post-truth could be viewed as labeling an era in which the anxiety to lose one's privilege, one's white privilege, results in declaring everything potential threat to this privilege as fake news. As Robert Major, Kay Beckerman, and Curtis Sullivan underlined, recent post-truth criticism has, citation, effaced epistemological, ontological, and axiological danger experienced by people of color. End of quote. They therefore consider post-truth as tainted by racial amnesia, which has led to the misinformed belief that an agreement on what counts as truth once existed within a society. In studying how different strands of Black history, including oral history, performed history, narratives, vernacular and cultural objects recur in contemporary art of the Black diaspora, I work towards new concepts for historiography operating diachronically and globally, rather than linear chronologically shaped by the singular perspective tainted by white supremacist thinking. My interest in the dialogical nature of the Afrotrope harks back to my doctoral research on Schlingensief's Opera Village Africa. The late Schlingensief developed Opera Village in collaboration with the world-renowned architect Francis Quéré in 2008. Opera Village operates as a transcultural platform in Burkina Faso for the exchange of dialogical images and therefore aligns with the Afrotrope in its endeavor to make strands of history and narratives visible that have been marginalized within mainstream discourses. I introduced the concept of the dialogical image functioning as an interface where multiple external and internal perspectives meet in my research, and was amazed how many parallels there are between the dialogical image and the Afrotrope. This term aligns with Walter Benjamin's account of the dialectical image, also Bakhtin's dialogism, conceiving of the self as an interface that spatially comprises multiple, often temporally unrelated perspectives, dialogical self-theory, and the dialectical concept which post-colonial scholar Robert Young describes as inherent in post-colonial theory. The notion of the dialogical image is the artistic response to an ongoing theoretical discourse on anti-essentialist construction of identity. This is closely tied to questions of identity politics and post-colonial theory. The notion of hybridity, for example, which Homi Baba introduced, alerts us to the fact that identities are never originally clearly fixed or stable. Rather, identities are shaped by a multiplicity of influences in a continuous process of negotiation, or, as Stuart Hall reminds us, constructed by encounters of difference. Negotiating between perspectives which do not correspond with one's own enriches the construction of identity. Key thinkers of the Frankfurt School made a substantial contribution to philosophical discourses behind anti-essentialist takes on identity. In his lectures on negative dialectics, Adorno no longer presupposes the identity between being and thinking, but rather the drifting apart of subject and object in their irreconcilability in a singular identity. The consequence of this, namely that a continuous dialogue is needed to mediate between diverging perspectives, is discussed in Jürgen Habermas' so-called discourse ethics. Habermas conceives of any monologic normative explanation as immoral. Rather, moral decisions require negotiation between multiple explanatory accounts. Structural resemblances to post-colonialism in its confrontation with the Western colonial narrative to the exclusion of narratives of the formerly colonized may be drawn here. I would like to offer one other recent example of engagement with Afrotropes in my own work. In 2019, I offered a seminar in collaboration with Haus der Kunst in Munich, in which we explored El Anatsui's Triumphant Scale exhibition against the backdrop of the Afrotrope. We found this particularly helpful as it allowed us to understand how reference to Black history materialized in El Anatsui's sculpture. For example, the bottle caps he uses are taken from a sort of liquor that functions as currency during the transatlantic slave trade. The Triumphant Scale was the last show Okwin Weser curated before his death. It was Okwin Weser who raised my awareness for Black history and the histories of the Global South when I, still at school, visited the documenta he curated in 2002. His Documenta 11 served as a foil when I studied art history, which has been taught in a rather Eurocentric way at my university in Berlin back then. My hope is that the Afrotrope provides a form to invert the Eurocentric perspective of art history and to pursue history as multiplicity of temporalities.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for sharing your perspectives and that critical context and more about your current research. I hope to do a little bit of the same right now. As an art historian invested in rethinking the legacies of American modernism through attention to its racialized foundations and elisions, Afrotropic inquiry gathers together a set of approaches that clarify the stakes of what a commitment to studying representation looks like, offering a model of what representation might represent for art history. While the word trope frequently connotes a motif or a figure, the kinds of figures assembled under the umbrella of the Afrotrope are incredibly capacious. Take the summary provided by Copeland and Thompson in Afrotropes, a user's guide, about topics of some of the articles published in the first years of their Afrotrope series. Quote, these articles highlight the mercurial flow of the Afrotrope across the globe, whether they focus on things such as chains or a wicker throne, personas like Bob Marley or Steve Biko, representations like the I am a man sign or a map of Africa, specific elements like sugar or salt, or particular visual effects like surface or shine, end quote. The different figures, as gathered together in these examples, attest to the way that Afrotropic inquiry's art historical work engages and expands upon the commitments of the figurative turn in Black cultural studies of a generation prior. Such commitments to genre-bending forms of discourse and to critical rhetoric, to the work of representation, spectatorial effects, and viewing relations, and to the kinds of materiality peculiar to things, to personas, and to representations, is not what the art world tends to mean when it invokes figuration. Certainly not a figuration that is posed in distinction to abstraction. The figures that Afrotropic inquiry attends to are rather irreducible to images, and they are modes of figuring irreducible to content, or to meaning, or to the signified. As Huey Copeland speaks about in his work on Afrotropic inquiry, equally at stakes here is a politics of the signifier, of signifiers that have been, in Copeland and Thompson's words, quote, transformed and deformed in response to the specific social, political, and institutional conditions that inform the experiences of Black people, as well as the changing historical perceptions of Blackness, end quote. It's this politics of the signifier that reckons with the performative nature of racism's bind at both the level of the material and specular economies of racialization, as well as the level of critical and institutional delimitations of art emerging from and engaging with African diaspora cultures. Another way that we could talk about the politics of this focused figurative attention to the materiality of the signifier might be to describe it as a discursive pivot. Afrotropic inquiry proceeds with the politics of representation and its vital strategies of oppositional looking, reading, creating, and identifying towards a politics of representational means. Thompson and Copeland use this latter phrase, representational means, in the introduction to their 2011 guest-edited issue of the journal Representations, Perpetual Returns, New World Slavery and the Matter of the Visual, a key precursor to the formation of the Afrotrope. And attending to the ways that, quote, Black subjects have appropriated widely available representational means only to undo their formal contours, break apart their significatory logic, or reduce them to their very substance, end quote, Thompson and Copeland insist on close attention to the work of signification in the context of various kinds of scaling outward, especially a scaling out to encompass the longue durée of slavery and its afterlives, and a scaling out from the human as a de facto subject of political representation to a study of such representations' cause and effects, including the violent economies of subjectification and subjection both. Such an approach asks that we reconsider, be more precise about, and also be more experimental with our art historical means as well. I first encountered the writing on Afrotropes a few years ago around that CAA right after submitting my doctoral dissertation, which tracked the deep reciprocity that the writer James Baldwin developed in relationship with key portraitists, painters and photographers that each made series of images of Baldwin in the decades of his transformation from an author of subcultural renown to a public intellectual known the world over. As I revised my dissertation into a book, I'm thinking about afrotropic inquiry to reapproach the formal and psychical possibilities of the practices that I study. I'm trying to clarify how the portrait vernaculars developed by these imagers index an important dimension of the civil rights movement's impact on American visual culture, as the movement helped visualize the structural conditions of racial fantasies as objects of interrogation in and of themselves. And I'm also trying to think about how and why, as these portraitists co-invented, reproduced, and reckoned with the iconicity of Baldwin's face, that their representations continually break down and dissolve portraiture's constitutive forms. An afrotropic analytic, I believe, can treat such concerted breakdowns in visual signification as beginnings and as continuations rather than endings. And this is premised upon understanding the terrain of representation as a kind of interminable doing, an ongoing figuring, which we, as viewers and artists and historians, very much take part. So as we get into today's proceedings, Sarah and I just want to gesture to a few key conditions forming the backdrop of afrotropic inquiry today, some factors that we see shaping art history's global imagination. So first, in Anglo-American academies, there's been a concerted effort to create more positions within art history that focus on the African diaspora. They further reflect a trend that Krista Thompson diagnosed in her 2011 article, A Sidelong Glance, in which she noticed how, as departments conflate African art history and African diasporic art histories with one another, they often unwittingly efface the last few decades of scholarship that explores the African diaspora's central place in the formation of Western modernity. Afrotropic inquiry, with its close attention to the processes of diasporic being and becoming, provides us with a crucial platform to think about such patterns of conflation and distinction within art history. Second, amidst the major civil rights protests that have put pressure on civic and cultural institutions over this last decade, more artists from across the African diaspora have received more recognition from major art institutions and the art market alike. The quality, quantity, and sustainability of these commitments merits our study and debate. These phenomena can be viewed in regards to the enduring mechanisms of tokenization which confront Black artists, as well as the market's earnest tropification of Black pain. They can also be studied for what's been produced beyond such traditional art world structures in regards to the flourishing of a number of critical alternative practices and discourses which have gained greater visibility in this moment. Lastly, as Sarah and I have touched on throughout this intro, Afrotrope's emphasis on repetition and reconfiguration, circulation and exchange, and nonlinear progressions of time and space contribute to the methodological possibilities of the global turn within art history. These interventions also help pressure normative ideals of quality or criticality that continue to set the standard for inclusion in collection and exhibitions of global art. Afrotropic inquiry turns us towards a global imagination that is about the rich potentials of our own attunements to the movements of objects and ideas across contexts, both in and beyond the visual.
We now have the great pleasure of inviting Dr. Huey Copeland and Dr. Krista Thompson to share some further introductory remarks. We would like to offer some brief views first. Huey Copeland is Andrew W. Mellon Professor at the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts and BFC Presidential Associate Professor of the History of Art at the University of Pennsylvania. An editor of October and a contributing editor of Art Forum, Copeland is the author of numerous publications addressing the implication of race and the aesthetic in the modern visual field, including Bound to Appear, Art, Slavery, and the Side of Blackness in Multicultural America, published in 2013 by the University of Chicago Press. At present, he is completing 2 additional book projects in this vein, the anthology Black Modernisms, co-edited with Stephen Nelson, and a collection of his writings, interviews, and essays entitled Touched by the Mother on Black Men, the Aesthetic Field, and Other Feminist Horizons, 1966 until today.
Krista Thompson is the Mary Jane Crow Professor of Art History at Northwestern University in Chicago. She's the author of An Eye for the Tropics, 2006, and Shine, The Visual Economy of Light in African Diasporic Aesthetic Practice from 2015, which is the recipient of the Charles Rufus Maury Award for Distinguished Book in History of Art from the CAA. Thompson is the co-editor of En Masse, Carnival and Performance Art of the Caribbean from 2015, and she and Huey Copeland are co-editors of an ongoing series of articles on afrotropes published by Art Journal. Her articles have appeared in American Art, Art Bulletin, Art Journal, Representations, The Drama Review, and Small Acts. Thompson is currently working on the manuscript, The Evidence of Things Not Captured, which examines notions of photographic absence, fugitivity, and disappearance in Jamaica, forthcoming from Duke University Press. She's also writing Blacklight, a manuscript about electronic light artist Tom Lloyd. Huey and Krista, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Levi and Sarah, for having us. And thank you both for those brilliant introductions to your own work and deployments of the Afrotrope. It's really exciting to hear your perspectives and how you've taken the idea in such rich directions. And of course, we have to thank you for your incredible perseverance and energy and patience in organizing this much delayed event and really assembling a fantastic community of speakers, which we're just thrilled to be in dialogue with. So I think I also want to thank those speakers, friends and colleagues, old and new, and of course, all of those of you who are tuning in this morning, this afternoon. So I'll just start with a few words about the Afrotrope that help flesh out the wonderful ways in which Levi and Sarah have already framed it before turning it over to Krista, who will offer some further reflections on the implications of Afrotropic thinking for global art history. So Krista and I define Afrotropes as those visual forms like the slave ship icon that recur across time and space in the African diaspora, influencing how Black subjects imagine themselves and negotiate technologies of visual transmission. As Sarah noted, in theorizing the Afrotrope, we have found inspiration in literary and art historical theories, but they must always be put in touch with and rethought in light of those held up by scholars of African diaspora culture, whose work emphasizes how Blackness forces a fundamental rethinking of our categories and modes of analysis, given the suppressed yet foundational role played by Black being in the making of the modern world. In so doing, we aim, as Afro-pessimist theorist Frank Wilderson might say, to hijack various models so that they may enable the focus on networks, relations, and ecologies, the performative links between human and non-human agents and objects that Afrotropic study demands. Cast in this light, inspired by the work of Karen Barad, the Afrotrope emerges as a species of being and doing, a distinctively hybrid formation that poses a challenge to notions of authorship and chronological narration, moving us in and out of the canon's orbit, both materially and temporally. Of course, I could not have coined that word without Krista, whose groundbreaking work on postcards and performative actions in the Anglophone Caribbean have permanently deformed my conceptualization of the terms African American art and their naturalized conjuncture, highlighting US imperialism's ongoing ability to export and impose its order of value across the globe through networks that are as diffuse as they are material. As we'll further discuss in our keynote, however, whereas Krista's work on the Afrotropic returns of Ivanhoe Martin, the Jamaican outlaw who inspired the 1972 cult film The Harder They Come, entails negotiating archival absence, the I Am a Man sign on which I work, famously held up by striking Memphis sanitation workers in 1968, means working through a kind of material excess. These two kinds of polarity, between the South and the North, the centrifugal and the centripetal, should not, however, be thought of as a pair of binary oppositions. Rather, they lay out the endpoints of the spectra that Afrotropes shuttle between, through, and within as they complete their circuits in and out of a contingent visibility. Thus, as concept and operation, the Afrotrope testifies to the importance of continually challenging, open, and collegial relationships to both ourselves and others in the emergence of alternative knowledges. And it's wonderful to hear that's in fact precisely how Sarah and Levi came to their discussion around the Afrotropes themselves. I think for us, humanistic study at its best embraces methodological promiscuity, holds on to its descriptive powers, and always questions its protocols in light of the transnational, interdisciplinary, and material entanglements that differentially produce the world and our encounters within it. Processes refracted by the very forms of knowledge in which the Afrotrope has been circulated and produced. The subject of conferences, courses, and seminars like this one, increasingly mounted across the globe, the Afrotrope, to our great joy and surprise, has become a productive means of engagement for thinkers variously focused on any number of material transmutations, from salts to riots to topsy-turvy dolls within the past and present of African diaspora cultural practices. In many of these instances, as we've already seen, our students and colleagues have not so much identified particular Afrotropes as aimed to refine the term through the deployment of the all-important Afrotropic analytic. For what Afrotropes bring into focus is not only the ubiquity and interiority of Black citational tactics, but also the extent to which all Western art produced in the wake of transatlantic slavery is haunted by the expropriated body of the slave, which continues to function as a model of value and a site for its endless extraction. And with that, I'll turn it over to Krista.
Thank you, Huey. I want to extend my thanks again to Levi and Sarah for bringing together such a wonderful set of panelists. Part of what the Afrotrope has been is a kind of collaborative project and only came into being through forms of collaboration across different platforms. So we're very thankful for offering this kind of platform for expounding on the concept of the Afrotrope. So I just want to address in a very succinct fashion some of the terms of the charge of the symposium, which really asks us to address the way that the Afrotrope might relate to a thinking about art history's global imagination. And I should say that instead of replicating conventional art historical kind of narratives that claim to be global, which can be universalist and or even imperialist in their scope, I want to suggest that the Afrotropic framework offers a way of looking at and prioritizing a new set of objects based on their significance to African diasporic communities. And in doing so, allows us to chart different spatial, geographic, and communal imaginaries precisely through looking at these objects. And the way that I kind of explain it to students when they kind of ask me about this concept is I just suggest, like, what would art history look like if it prioritized a set of objects that were important to people of African descent, right? What would that look like? What would the choice of objects be? How would it get us to rethink notions of authorship? Often objects that become central within a kind of Afrotropic kind of framework are objects where we lose a sense of who the maker is, right? And its importance comes through its circulation and being kind of taken up in this kind of communal sense across time and geography. It also, so it's just to say that it's not only about getting us to rethink a set of objects, but to rethink a set of values that we place on the objects that we might study within the art historical discourse. I also think that it's interesting to think about the way that charting how Afrotropes appear across time also gives us another way of thinking about kind of temporality, right? What do notions of temporality look like if we chart the way that Afrotropes appear and when they appear and why, as another kind of framework for thinking about how time unfolds or historical, you know, looking at these images for what they tell us about time or historical unfolding, or is it folding? Interestingly, the art journal issue that the art journal series that Huey and I have been editing is the only series on a topic that doesn't appear in a single volume, but has been kind of taking place on its own kind of temporal logic across time within the journal. And it's really, again, trying to get us to think critically about how we even need to change our platforms when we're kind of thinking about the Afrotropic. And finally, I would just say that, you know, the Afrotrope, the notion of tropos, from the Greek to turn, that an important part of the Afrotrope too, again, going back to something that Levi said about like the portrait, how we can think newly about the portrait, is that it makes us turn and have this critical reevaluation of what the photographic is and is supposed to do, what the image of violence in South Africa, apartheid South Africa, how those images can be turned to have kind of other lives. And so I look forward to extending the conversation about the kind of methodologies and new forms of archives that can kind of extend our understanding of this concept.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you again both for being here. We're so looking forward to your conversation at the end of our study day. In the meantime, I just want to invite our audience to join us in a few minutes, let's say 2:45 British time, for the start of our first panel. See you soon. And now I have the pleasure of introducing our final speaker for this panel, who is Alvin Zabunyan. Zabunyan is a contemporary art historian and art critic born and raised in Paris and a professor at the University of Rennes. For over 25 years, she's worked across issues of race and feminism, as well as on the political and cultural history of the US in relation to artistic activism since the 60s. Her book, Black as a Color, A History of African-American Contemporary Art, published in French and English, won the SAES AFEA Research Prize in 2005. She contributes to national and international publications and is the author of 4 monographs and numerous articles in periodicals and essays, as well as in books as well as exhibition catalogs, including, to name a few, recent essays on Adrian Piper, Ellen Gallagher, LaToya Ruby Frazier, and Candida Wiley. She recently co-edited the special issue Experimenting History with Contemporary Art for the journal Slaveries and Post-Slaveries in 2020, as well as the anthology Subjective Constellations for Feminist Art History in 2020. She was in 2016-2017 the co-director of the annual program of the German Center for Art History in Paris, centering on the plural post-colonial and decolonial perspectives of art historiographies, deconstructing colonial hegemonies of the Western world. And she's currently the leader of a work package on artists and citizens in Marseille, Bristol, and Cape Town for the Horizon 2020 program Echoes. I'd like to now welcome Alvin for her presentation, The Photographic Portrait of Rastafari by the Boyajians, an Afrotrope in Relation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I will share my screen now. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers and say how glad I am to be taking part in this event with such an inspiring title, Afrotropes and Art Histories, Global Imagination. As an art historian, the notion of global imagination has always had a great influence in the way I do research, and I will present today will emphasize the experimental investigation through space and time. In the summer of 2007, I visited the exhibition, The Boyajians, Armenian Photographs from the Court of the Niggers, organized by the Jeu de Paume in Paris. The exhibition displayed objects, text, and photographs, and highlighted the singular destiny of an Armenian family, the Boyajians, official photographers of the Niggers over several generations, and privileged witnesses of the life of the Armenian community in Ethiopia in the 20th century. The image you see on the screen was the first one that immediately caught my attention. This is a portrait of Rastafari photographed on the 2nd November 1930, the day he was crowned Emperor Haile Selassie I. The photographer who took this picture is one of the official photographers of the Ethiopian royal family and a member of the Boyajian family. To prepare this presentation, I conducted several research studies to try to piece together the thread of this story. The chronological information is not all synchronous, and the Jeu de Paume visit brochure specifies that the father, I quote, Bedros Boyadjian, born in Armenia, became one of the photographers of the court of Menelik. He was succeeded by his sons, Haigaz and Tony. Tony Boyadjian became photographer to the court of Rastafari, the future Emperor Haile Selassie, at the end of the 1920s. He is responsible for the many official portraits of the ruler. It is especially in the work of the French-Armenian historian Boris Adjemian, a great specialist of the Armenians in Ethiopia, that I could find the most complete historical information. He states, I quote, Bedros Boyadjian received the title of the photographer of the imperial court in 1906, which is passed down to his sons Haigaz in 1928 and Tony in 1941, end of quote. It turns out that the image was probably not the photographer who took the image, the picture was not Tony, but Haigaz Boyadjian. Adjemian analysis also focuses on the special status of the Armenians. They are stateless and therefore do not represent a threat to Ethiopia. He states, I quote, the utilization of stateless Armenians was not contradictory to this principle of Ethiopia's foreign policy, since they did not represent any external state or any political threat, and moreover, since they were considered as genuine co-religionists by the Ethiopian Church. From the reign of Menelik to the fall of the Ethiopian monarchy in 1974, the goldsmiths of the imperial court were all Armenians. Adjemian also writes, quote, one of the very few foreigners designated by name in Menelik's chronicle is the Armenian goldsmith Dickerman, who was able to make crowns. Armenian photographers took all the official portraits of the monarchs until the revolution. The photography of the emperors had been placed under strict political control soon after its introduction to the palace. The same article states that Armenian immigration to Ethiopia began in the last decades of the 19th century. Armenian became one of the main groups of foreigners in Ethiopia during the reign of Menelik, at a time when there were only few foreigners. What we also learn from Adjemian is that the king's friendship towards Armenians received, I quote, such a great resonance inside the small Ethio-Armenian community that it has become the leitmotif of an oral grand narrative remapping Ethiopia as a homeland of substitution, far from the usual conception of diasporas inextricably linked to the remote land of their ancestors. It invites the kind of attention that diaspora studies should pay not only to movement, fluidity, and networks, but also the social, cultural, and political settlings of individuals and groups in their host societies, end of quote. I was particularly interested in this equivalence between movement, fluidity, networks, and settlings in host societies. Through the issue of National Geographic published in June 1931, which allowed in a way the journey of Haile Selassie's portrait to Jamaica, inaugurating the Rastafari movement, this is a story that is both fluid and settled. I will come back to this aspect a little later. This issue of National Geographic that reached Jamaica would so mark the beginning of the movement. Addison Southart's report and Robert Moore's photographs emphasize the grandiloquence of the event. The National Geographic photographer acknowledges the privilege of taking the photograph you see on the screen, and he noticed, quote, "The centuries seem to have slipped suddenly backward into biblical ritual," end of quote. For the Rastafarians, the coronation of Haile Selassie is proof that Marcus Garvey's prophecy from the 1920s is real. As Rex Netterford states in his book, Mirror, Mirror, Identity, Race, and Protest in Jamaica, I quote, "The Rastafarian twin concepts of African redemption, repatriation to Ethiopia, and the divinity of the most revered ruler in Africa, Haile Selassie I, King of Kings, the conquering Lion of Judah, and to the Rastafarians, the Christ reincarnate, have marked the Rastafari movement of, ever since its inception in 1930, from the increasing and varied Jamaican manifestations of Black awareness and of consciousness of the African heritage in Jamaican life," end of quote. In the perspective of a return to motherland, in this case Ethiopia, Leonard Howell, the famous preacher, also known as the first Rasta, is the one who, as early as 1932, proclaimed Haile Selassie as the supreme being. He sold several thousand photographs of the emperor's coronation as passports to Ethiopia. A photograph can thus symbolically suggest a journey, a direction, a path to cross seas and continents. I will now mention the different concepts that I want to link to these ideas. I wanted to follow an intuition and try to link the trope to the tropism, and instead of thinking about the variation of the figures, understand them in their mutual attraction. I therefore reflected on the original meaning of the term tropism. It is mainly used in the field of biology and emphasizes the orientation, particularly of a plant, toward a direction that attracts it irremediably. I then chose to connect it to the concept of relation proposed by the great Martinican thinker and poet Edouard Glissant, who, in Poetics of Relation, suggests to think about the stakes of difference that would be in resonance within a globality. He says, I quote, "Evolving cultures infer relation, the overstepping that grounds their unity, diversity. While phototropism shows the plant growing towards the light and the sun, hydrotropism indicates an attraction to water. And here is the mangrove, where the roots are visible and the trees seems to stand on stilts. The symbolism of the mangrove as a support for Caribbean archipelago thought carried by Glissant is linked to the concepts of rhizome created by Deleuze and Guattari. This is what Glissant writes in Poetics of Relation at the beginning of his chapter entitled Errantry, Exile. Quote, "Roots make the commonality of errantry and exile, for in both instances, roots are lacking. We must begin with that." Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari criticized notions of the root and perhaps even notions of being rooted. The root is unique, a stock taking all upon itself and killing all around it. In opposition to this, they propose the rhizome, an enmeshed root system, a network spreading either in the ground or in the air, with no predatory rootstock taking over permanently. The notion of the rhizome maintains, therefore, the idea of rootedness, but challenges that of a totalitarian root. Rhizomatic thought is the principle behind what I call the poetics of relation, in which each and every identity is extended through a relationship with the other. End of quote. To come back to what I referred to at the beginning about the fluid and settled nature of Rastafari culture, I would like to quote a thought that I found extremely inspiring in Nettlesforth's analysis. He writes, "Just as the kingdom of heaven is within you, instead of somewhere in the clouds, Africa is in Jamaica," goes the reasoning. Some argue that Jamaica is Africa. End of quote. The images I'm presenting show how the fusion between Africa, represented by Ethiopia, and emblematic figure of Haile Selassie in particular, is diffused in popular culture, notably in music, making the image of the emperor, who, by the way, has officially declined his divinity, the afrotrope par excellence. This fusion became real when, in 1966, Haile Selassie officially visited Jamaica and met the Rastafarians. The photographic portrait of Haïgaz Boyadjian and the symbolic name of Haile Selassie can be found here, as a song title on t-shirts. And here on a banner presenting the city of Bath as a tourist attraction. Thanks to the artist and associate professor at the University of West England, Bristol, Dr. Sean Naftali Sobers, whom I met as a part of the ECO's research program, I was lucky enough to visit in March 2020 the house in which Haile Selassie lived during his exile in England between 1936 and 1940 or 1941, depending on the dates. Indeed, Keith Bower's book indicates 1940, and by coincidence, he's presenting his book published in 2016 in 3 days from now at the Fairfield House. While Sean Naftali Sobers' work, The House Where God Lived, tells that it was until 1941. We can read also that he's on the image on the screen, Fairfield House, where the royal Ethiopian exile lived in the city, is now a site of pilgrimage for the Rastafari faithful and members of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church for all over the world. That this house of exile becomes a milestone of heritage to the Rastafarians of the world is a key element. It is also a historical disruptive moment. First, we have the journey of photographs from Ethiopia to Jamaica. Then this exile at the very moment when the Rastafari movement is initiated in Jamaica. Then the moment when Haile Selassie gives the house to the city of Bath in 1958, and then 1966, when Haile Selassie visits Jamaica himself. And then this house, which is now a site of pilgrimage. Fairfield House is a heritage site with the familiarity of a house that was once inhabited by a great popular figure. It is a museum that reconstructs the journey of a man considered a divinity and tells the history of the Rastafari culture. There, the portrait by Haïgaz Boyadjian can be seen in several forms. The Armenian memory joins the Ethiopian memory thanks to Rastafari culture. The contrast is striking and deeply moving as one feels a profound respect for these places as well as for the aged people who gather there in this house and the people who work there. There is also a library with a fine collection of books. One of them was written by Haile Selassie's great daughter, Hannah Mariam Merete Selassie. And the title itself is moving. It was only yesterday. When one turned the pages of the book, there is a chapter entitled My Family and the Armenian Connection. And a few pages before it begins, there is the famous official coronation photograph from 1930. The photo on the right, now on the screen, shows a portrait of Haile Selassie pinned to the door as a simple and accessible icon, one of the few photos where he appears to be smiling. The caretaker plaque contrasts with the latter, but also goes hand in hand with the simplicity of Rastafari culture, which grew out of the political struggles of Jamaica's working class and gave rise to Black Power. The global imagination of art history is a wonderful concept that leaves all the windows of the world wide open. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Aven, for that rich paper and for entering this discussion through these sort of overlapping diaspora conditions. This is really incredibly fascinating stuff. Thank you. So, hello and good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to our second session of the day. For those of you just joining us, we're going to have 3 speakers this session, followed by a Q&A, and we really encourage our audience to submit questions throughout the presentations because our panelists will get to see them and address them at the end. So I have the great pleasure of introducing our first speaker, Danveer Singh Brar, who is a lecturer in Black British History in the School of History at University of Leeds. He's published 2 books, Beefy's Tune, the Dean Blunt edit with the 87 Press, and Tech Life Ghettoville Esky, the sonic ecologies of Black music in the early 21st century with Goldsmiths Press and MIT Press. So I'd like to welcome Danveer for his paper titled Knowing Manufacture of an R&B Feeling.
Thank you, Levi and Sarah, for the invitation, and thanks for all the people who spoke in the first panel. It was a great start to the afternoon. Well, when Levi and Sarah initially asked me to the first attempted iteration of this Afrotropes event, I started working on something to try to respond to and think about the question of the Afrotrope in relation to particular things that stimulate and interest me intellectually and politically and artistically, and it kind of initiated something which became a lot bigger, and so rather than kind of just leave the set of notes and thoughts I prepared for the first version of the conference to one side and then just return to them now, I just decided to carry on working on them, and this thing has kind of spun out into a much larger set of thoughts. So with regards to that, I want to say 2 things. One was that what I'm going to present today is just a portion of what feels like a longer piece of writing. And although it might not appear as if the question of the Afrotrope is in there, it definitely is. It's what initiated everything. And secondly, the central kind of artwork that I'm responding to here is a work by the artist Adam Farrow, who also works under the project title Free Yard, and their work, which is called Regnaught's N22 Momentation Mix. And I think just going over this morning what I've written for today, I don't think I'll have time to actually play the work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share it in the chat so people can can watch it as a video work, can watch it and take it in their own time, because I don't want to eat up time for other panelists too much. But if somehow we magically find enough time, we can play it. It's relatively short. It's about 3 minutes long. And the other thing I want to say as a kind of prefatory note is that I'll use the term Black music throughout what I'm going to read. And it appears in three kind of guises. One is Black music, where the term Black and music are capitalized at the start, so they're in uppercase. And then Black music in lowercase. And then also Black music appears in terms of, in reference to a particular text written in 1968. So I'll signal this as I'm reading. It's just one of the, I guess, you try to be cute and intricate whilst you're writing something, but then we're having to read it out loud. It all falls apart. So I hope it isn't too clunky, but it is what it is. So I'll just actually I've got some slides I wanted to share, so I'll put them up. Okay. I hope those are visible for everyone.
Yep, looks good.
Perfect, thank you. Somehow it is possible to be so right about R&B and at the same time get Black music, the text, so wrong. I discovered this by reading Simone White's essay poem, Dear Angel of Death, which makes up the second half of her 2018 collection that shares the same title. A revelation of this type, though, only seems to produce a set of conundrums. If such a generative retuning of the case for R&B as a vehicle for feelings can be made by White, while she conducts what appears to be, if read generously, a careless, if read honestly, a willful mishandling of Amiri Baraka's 1966 essay, The Changing Same, R&B and New Black Music, that closes his 1968 text, Black Music, then where does this leave us with both Black music lowercase as a living continuum and Black music uppercase as an intellectual tradition of thinking and writing about Blackness? In part, the basis for such a conundrum lies in her decision to take up the essay poem as mode. I certainly do not think it is the mode as such, but rather White's use of it, which allows so much to go right and yet so much to go wrong in Dear Angel of Death. Let's begin with the signature case made by White for another way of listening to and writing about R&B. It is in the course of, quote, casting around for a route into thinking the, quote, qualities of Black music that White hits upon Black radio. Referring to an institution as much as a means for broadcast, Black radio is a technology of reminiscence, a repository of memory that is indicative of the way, quote, we make culture entirely in retrospect. For White, assembling Black diasporic culture through, quote, recollection, remembrance, and review means an unavoidable contention with, quote, rejection and revulsion as part of the deal. It is the cohabitation of, quote, persistent contextual negativity with, quote, consistently pleasing connection that brings R&B into the picture. Generally understood as a social music fecund with private affairs, R&B's very thickness is a condition of the way it ignores the slicing up of the spatial and the ideological. In White's listening, the, quote, open access structure of R&B brings along with it, as its condition of possibility, a, quote, soft disgust. Audible across artists as varied as Clear and Ann Peebles, Rufus and Hall & Oates, Madonna and Luther Vandross, the Isley Brothers and our Leah. What R&B does is, quote, establish a spread for affective recon, where everybody is pressed together and recovering from pressing. The double register of pressing is White's focal point. The thing that makes R&B what it is the fact that given the materials after which the music is constructed, the line between being pressed together and recovering from pressing relies upon muddying the waters of the historical and the sensual. Open access or soft disgust, consistent pleasure or persistent negation, reminiscence or repulsion, R&B can do without neither. White's talking of R&B's registers carries some heavy Hartminian overtones. Black performance as the diffusion of Black negation, as opposed to its transformation, thus allowing such negation to become part of the general racial economy of pleasure. The double register of pressing turns into a question of availability in R&B. The music's allures cannot avoid pulling on a deeper sense of the available. And the larger quotes I'm using on the slides, I won't read out again, just to not eat up so much time. I'll leave them there for people to kind of take in on their own. Within this troublesome seductive zone of the pressed and the available, one White understands as, quote, simultaneously an act of gauging an erotic softness or exchange and of being inside the felt pleasure of others. R&B is more than capable of producing its own Pied Pipers. Quote, you don't like it, it's not for you, yet nothing is wrong with it. R. Kelly peeing on people. The proposition White is making for R&B as a modality of listening and thinking rests on holding seduction and disturbance together. Everything about the music that heightens our sense of overnourishment is conditioned by a horrifying fungibility. R&B is so open with its intimacies because it emerges from a history of material availability. Hearing R&B in this manner requires, quote, thinking about Black music, in uppercase, as a tradition that causes revulsion, where pressing, togetherness, and availability coalesce in a quote, feeling of unwanted feeling. In this representation of the mechanics of R&B feeling, it is inevitable and necessary that White chooses to move through and looks to break with a Murray Baraka. There are innumerable ways of describing his multimodal poetics, but if considered through the lens of Dear Angel of Death, we could say that Baraka set the terms for a discourse on Black music, lowercase, as the locus for the production and theorization of Black social, aesthetic, and political and philosophical feeling, otherwise known as Black music, uppercase. And it is Baraka's terms White is looking to situate herself in relation to, in order to initiate a deviation away from them. It is important at this stage to remind ourselves that the purpose of Dear Angel of Death is not so much to make a better case for R&B than those already on the table. The stated aim of the essay poem is to use the open access soft disgust dynamic of R&B to make a claim on the dominant Black social music of the current African-American conjuncture, namely trap. For White, if Black music, lowercase, is the insistent and incessant producer and register of present Black social feeling, and if a system of thinking called Black music, uppercase, has been constructed around attempts to think Black music, lowercase, then the historical form of Black music, uppercase, is inadequate to the present state of Black music, lowercase, in the guise of trap. The accepted logics of Black music, uppercase, have been assembled through a careful listening of prior and preferred musical forms. And for White, it has not been suitably updated to deal with the conditions and feelings carried in trap. Her sense is that there is not a desire to undertake such a renewal. The source of the blockage is the overbearing presence of Baraka. For a large part of Dear Angel of Death, White proceeds to identify the ways and means by which Baraka and the progeny he has constructed prove insufficient to the immediacy of trap. In fact, she spends far more time on this endeavor, unable to, quote, get off this page, than making the case for trap on its own terms. Critiques of Baraka are nothing new. One half of her two-pronged interrogation of him and his influence works off the back of some fairly well-established and for the large part legitimate lines of argumentation. This rests on the way Baraka has built an edifice, a structure of thinking called Black music, uppercase, both through whom and how he cited W.E.B. Du Bois, and those who went to arrange sections of his own writing on their own pages, Nathaniel Mackey and Fred Moten being the primary apprentices in this engineering scheme. The result is a, quote, history of ideas as murmurings between the masculine order of Black writing, an order that values being seen together. As a masculine history of ideas, the edifice known as Black music is built upon scenes of transcription. What occurs when Baraka hails Du Bois, and then in turn Mackie and Moten hail him and each other, is for White not simply the construction of methods for listening to Black music, lowercase, but the construction of an intellectual space in which men speak to each other about the nature of Black music, uppercase. All of this comes together in White's concept metaphor of the author/ship. So the word authorship with the slash coming in between the two kind of conjoined terms. By now, also including Wilson Harris, Paul Gilory, and Ralph Ellison, the intellectual space these authors have built is akin to a ship, one they use to hold themselves together and to navigate the choppy waters of Black diasporic music. The choice of metaphor is, of course, no happy accident on White's part. The ship being the vessel that generates and conditions the historical structures of Black existence in the diaspora, and thus generates the conditions and existence of the music. The good authorship Black music, uppercase, is manned by a motley crew, all of whom in White's sense possess indissoluble authority, no matter how much they claim to disperse it. Although Angela Davis, Farah Jasmine Griffin, Daphne A. Brooks, Hazel Carby, Jana Brown, Catherine McKittrick, Shana L. Redmond, Tsitsi Jaji, and Fumi Akiji might take some issue with the claim that the arena of Black music, uppercase, is, quote, some obsessive old boys club. It is not gender in and of itself that is the object of critique in Dear Angel of Death. Class and taste are the means by which White really looks to go to work on Baraka as the ship's captain. In her reading of The Changing Same, she takes the position that the defining problem of Black music, uppercase, as it is being constructed by Baraka and his crew, and which prevents it as functioning as a generative hermeneutic for the present conditions of Black music, lowercase, is the intellectual overdetermination of new Black music, Baraka's term, or Black art music, which is White's term. For those who aren't aware, the term new Black music, when it was announced by Baraka in '66, was used for what we now perhaps would identify as free jazz, the music usually exemplified by John Coltrane, Ornette Coleman, Cecil Taylor. And White's use of the term Black art music isn't necessarily entirely clear, but she does refer to, again, a particular contemporary experimental musician called Matana Roberts in reference to this phrase. As the founding document in the construction of Black music, uppercase, The Changing Same contains an originary flaw, which White believes has not only gone largely unacknowledged, but has been reproduced. This flaw is the opposition Baraka apparently sets up between R&B as indicative of, quote, and this is a quote from White, of Black popular music as viscerally pleasurable roots, and yet philosophically inadequate for thinking Black life beyond the scope of its propertyhood, and, to quote White again, the distinctive expressive actions of Black genius present in the free music he adores. He being Baraka. Baraka, according to White, is dismissive of the, and these are all White's terms, mundane, run-of-the-mill, small-minded romantic hysteria of regular feeling of the R&B that dominated Black popular music in 1966. The logic of Dear Angel of Death is that Baraka makes these intellectual maneuvers solely in order to exalt the more obscured, again White's terms, self-consciously avant-garde attempt by a cohort of Black musicians to pursue a higher ideal of freedom. White proposes that this is the problem with The Changing Same, which has been reverberated and tightened across the generations in the continual work on the ship of Black music, uppercase. And what it has led to is a self-elected group of, quote, experimental music people who are unable to critically respond to the mass presence of trap. To label Baraka a, quote, poet legislator, which again, White's term, is for the most part a fair comment, although I would prefer to think of him as an adjudicator, issuing fiery, wild judgments under constant revision. But to say that he makes class distinctions between R&B and new black music in order to indicate the root black music uppercase as the vehicle for black aesthetic and political philosophy should take is an argument from White that simply does not hold if we go back and do our homework on the changing same. Read through Baraka's essay carefully, listen to it, and we begin to wonder what is going on with Dear Angel of Death. Take, for instance, the closing paragraph of the changing same as an exemplary concentration of the intricate argument he has spent the previous 30 pages weaving. If he is trying to do anything in the essay, it is not to draw hard, impermeable lines of class, taste, and revolutionary proprietary between R&B and new black music. Rather, Baraka is looking to understand them in their distinctiveness and show how they are drawing water from the same well. Both R&B and new black music, and these are now Baraka's terms, are redistributed elements of a core impulse. They are launched from the same, quote, place. Throughout the changing same, he's at pains to point out that despite the surface alterations in, quote, direction and intent, these should not be understood as fixed delineations of form and content between R&B and new black music. Unfortunately, this is precisely the portion White chooses to omit in her own lengthy citation from Baraka's essay. Therefore, it comes as no surprise to find Baraka praising, quote, the high poetry in the final character of their delivery when writing of Smokey Robinson and the Miracles. This is no affectation or empty platitude. He concretely followed through on this claim in the only way possible, by making a record. Soul and Madness was made in 1968 at the Spirit House in Newark, New Jersey, with a group called Black and Beautiful. It features a cut, Beautiful Black Women, which, quote, use Smokey Robinson's Ooh Baby Baby as a model. And that's a quote from the liner notes of Soul and Madness. Listen, and you hear Baraka and his crew paying homage to another collective of poets, a group White accuses him of condescending to. The organizational principle behind the performance and recording of Beautiful Black Women is self-evident. Any sense of revolutionary black poetry, of militant black word, quote, word music Baraka had was derivative, a secondary rhythm, moving in the slipstream of R&B. If anything, that is the crux of the argument in the changing same. Despite the appearance of formal radicalism in new black music, it's really coming back to a place R&B never left and is continually revising. New black music, in its detour through and theft from avant-gardism, quote, and this is a Baraka quote, hopes to arrive at expression and spontaneity. The R&B begins with expression and spontaneity as its ends, which are the ends of any black music. In his listening out for, quote, unity music, in the audible hints he was catching of, quote, people leap, Baraka is convinced R&B is ready and waiting. It is new black music that needs to catch up and synthesize. As I said, this leaves us with the puzzle, the conundrum of Dear Angel of Death. If the grounds of the essay poem's calls for a new hermeneutic of black music, due to an apparent ingrained class prejudice the crew of the ship has towards the mundane and black popular music in favor of black art music, are built on such a poor fulfillment of critical responsibility to the words on the page, then what does this say about the stance White takes? To be honest, I'm not totally sure, but one way of reading Dear Angel of Death is to say that despite its claims to the contrary, what might be at work here is an implicit suggestion that those who White designates as living aesthetic lives on the block are incapable of accessing anything which sounds like her particular sense of art and music, even if they come from the same neighborhood. But the object here is not to get up in Simone White's face. I doubt we move in the same circles anyway. Instead, what I would like to do is borrow the terms of Dear Angel of Death and take them on a walk, perhaps never giving them back. Or even if they are returned, they are likely to be inoperable for White. Because there is another way of accessing the sense and sensuality of R&B. The music can be heard and thought about without requiring anyone to leave the block, without relying on an opposition between the seemingly mundane and a highly stylized rendering of art music. I've been taught all of this by taking walks with Free Yard. In their social,
sorry to interrupt you. We just have a few minutes left, if possible.
Yeah, sure. It's the last couple of sentences.
Sorry.
Cool. No worries. I've been taught all of this by taking walks with Free Yard. In their social world and in their social work, a walk is always a mix. With Regnork's N22 monumentation mix, we get a lesson on the structural principles of R&B as a people's art that is art precisely because it is populated. Regnork's is made up of 3 components: a 2002 recording of the British R&B act Sugar Babes performing their hit Stronger on the now decommissioned Top of the Pops television show. Their performance is activated on a Sony PSP player, a now defunct piece of mobile leisure technology. And the Sugar Babes are being broadcast on the PSP as they float in the middle of the screen, superimposed over footage of the streets of Wood Green Shopping Centre in the N22 postcode in North London. If we pay attention to the way Free Yard pays attention, if we handle Regnork's the way it carefully handles the Sugar Babes, the PSP, and all the people out on their daily business, another route to R&B is opened up. The means by which Free Yard reveals to us another way of seeing the street as a hearing of the music by blocking the field of vision contains the answers to another conundrum, one buried in Baraka's essay. Music makes an image, what image? That's it. Thank you.
So I would like to welcome you to our 3rd session. And again, for those who have just joined us, we would like to alert the audience that we have allocated time for questions from the audience after the presentations, and you can type in your questions into the chat so that they can be asked on your behalf later on. But now I really would like to introduce Dr. Amy Mooney from Columbia College and Julia Smith from Oxford, who are delivering the first presentation in this panel. And unfortunately, as I said, this will be the only one because Kala Attia can't join us because of a personal emergency. Amy Mooney and Julia Smith initially planned a workshop together with us, like at Oxford, accompanying this event, which was scheduled initially like kind of for 1 year ago and interrupted plans due to the pandemic. So I'm glad that they will be able to join us today and talk about this planned workshop. A brief note that Julia is unfortunately unable to join us today, but Amy and Julia have pre-recorded their lecture for us, and we will circle back with Amy during the Q&A portion of the session. But before we start the pre-recorded lecture, let me please introduce both speakers. So Dr. Amy Mooney is an associate professor of art history at Columbia College Chicago. Her publications include a monograph, Archibald J. Motley Jr., as well as contributions to anthologies and catalogs, including Beyond Face, New Perspectives in Portraiture. She is a recipient of fellowships from the American Council of Learned Societies, the National Portrait Gallery, the Newberry Library, the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and the Terra Foundation for American Art. In collaboration with Dr. Deborah Willis, she recently launched a digital humanities project, Say It With Pictures, Then and Now, that recovers and examines Chicago's African American photographers from the 1890s into the 1930s. While serving as the 2019-2020 Terra Foundation Visiting Professor of American Art at Oxford University, she delivered Regarding the Portrait, a 4-part lecture series that draws from her forthcoming book, Acts of Portraiture, Etiquette, Empathy, and Progressive Visions of America, which investigates the social function of portraiture. And Dr. Julia Smith is a Leverhulme Early Career Research Fellow at the Ruskin School of Art and Worcester College at the University of Oxford. Previously, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the Getty Research Institute and the Paul Mellon Center for British Art. Dr. Julia Smith specializes in modern and contemporary art with an emphasis on the legacies of empire in Britain and across the Atlantic world. Her research focuses in particular on the eco-aesthetic and eco-poetic traditions of the transnational Caribbean in relation to Eurocentric and especially British conceptions of nature, landscape, and ecology. Titled Living Landscapes, Biotic Resistance in the Transnational Caribbean, her current book project considers visual objects and literary texts produced in the second half of the 20th century alongside contemporary artworks that mobilize geophysical entities and climatic phenomena in support of counter-hegemonic critiques of colonial and neo-colonial regimes of oppression and environmental exploitation. Preliminary publications relating to this research are forthcoming with Tate Publishing and in British Art Studies. So please join me in welcoming Amy and Julia.
Good afternoon and greetings to you all. My name is Amy Mooney, and along with my colleague, Dr. Julia Smith, we would like to thank the organizers for the symposium, Drs. Levi Probaum and Sarah Hegenbart, for inviting us to contribute to today's considerations of the Afrotrope. We'd also like to express our appreciation of the Courtauld Institute of Art, the Department of Art History at Oxford University, as well as the Ruskin School of Art. Our presentation was pre-recorded and will begin with Dr. Smith and will alternate back and forth between us, reflecting the collaborative nature of our work. We look forward to our discussion and questions afterwards.
In the autumn of 2019, Professor Mooney and I began collaborating on the organization of an interdisciplinary workshop on the uses of the Afrotrope. Little did we know that a global pandemic would completely undo our plans. The event was to take place in the spring of 2020 at Worcester College, one of the oldest institutions within the University of Oxford. Professor Mooney and I had both recently joined the college and were encouraged by Professor Kate Tunstall, who at the time was a provost, to build on a mutual expertise on the art and visual cultures of the African diaspora. The invitation to collaborate came at a time of tentative institutional change, which had been partly prompted by the Rhodes Must Fall campaign set up in 2015 by a group of Oxford students. As is well known, the campaign centered around demands for the removal of Cecil Rhodes' statue from the facade of Oriel College and was part of a global movement to decolonize the university. In spite of enormous resistance, last summer the statue was finally scheduled for removal with public support from only 3 college heads, one of whom was Professor Tunstall, our provost. Under her tenure, Worcester College has made significant efforts to revise its recruitment protocols as well as its pedagogical offer in order to make itself more welcoming to Black and minority ethnic students. Now, the extent to which this operation has been successful is, of course, open to debate and criticism, as is the question of whether any university, but especially one as deeply steeped in the legacy of empire as Oxford, could ever be truly decolonized. Writing on the question of decolonizing our history, Tim Barringer rightly pointed out that it would be a, quote, dissimulation to behave as if this discipline were a colonized territory fighting for independence. The same might be said about the university as an institution rooted in imperial techniques of knowledge production. Indeed, Eve Tuck and Kay Wei Young have been at pains to argue that decolonization is not a metaphor, insisting that its primary goal should be the reclamation of indigenous lands rather than the creation of diverse university curricula or the reshuffling of museum collections. While the legitimacy of this argument is pretty irrefutable, it is also true that it fails to fully translate from an American to a British context, where the possibility of decolonial futures is less tied up with questions of ancestral land ownership than with the survival of imperial narratives and circuits of fiscal transactions at an institutional level. Universities, heritage buildings, public monuments, and museums all play a pivotal role in Britain as sites where the history of white settler domination might be actively renegotiated. While for Tuck and Young, such forms of institutional critique risk securing nothing more than the reproduction of what they call white settler futurity, in Britain they do pose a threat to the establishment. One only needs to think of the outcry that followed the toppling of Edward Colton's statue in Bristol during the Black Lives Matter protests triggered by the murder of George Floyd by the Minneapolis police in May 2020, to understand that in the former imperial metropole, the question of historical memory goes to the heart of long overdue debates about structural racism. Backed by Parliament, this backlash recently involved efforts by the Culture Secretary Oliver Dowden to curtail the editorial freedoms of public collections in a bid to prevent further interrogations of the crime of empire. Specifically, in October, Dowden wrote to national museums and arm's-length heritage bodies, warning that they should be consistent with government guidelines to retain and explain controversial items and collections, was also asking that the same institutions notify the ministry of any actions or public statements planned with regards to contested heritage. The Museum Association understandably replied by stating that, quote, "We are concerned that the Secretary of State's recent letter implies that government funding may be withheld if museums do not comply, and denies museums the responsibility to take carefully considered decisions about contested heritage in consultation with staff and their communities." This exchange alone gives us a measure of the culture wars that risk setting the United Kingdom even further back in its path towards granting justice and reparations to victims of colonial violence and their descendants. Even setting aside the fraught language of decolonization, the fact remains that there is significant appetite across the education and museum sectors for learning provision that might support a process akin to what Ariella Azoulay has called unlearning imperialism through the practice of potential history. The Afrotrope was to provide us with just such a tool set. Afrotropes, Professors Copeland and Thompson write, give form to that which has remained at times unspoken and unseen, enabling a fresh consideration of what is repressed or absented within the visual archive. We hope to test this proposition by working directly with items from the Pitt Rivers Museum at the University of Oxford, one of the leading ethnographic, archaeological, and anthropological collections in the world, and an institution whose founding at the end of the 19th century was deeply entangled with the fortunes of the British Empire.
Along with other sections of the university, the museum has now embarked on a long-term project of self-decolonization, which, among other things, entails the removal of contentious displays, such as the human remains that were featured in the Pitt Rivers display case labeled Treatment of Dead Enemies. This decision is in open contrast with governmental guidelines, which instead advise to retain and explain certain controversial objects. At the same time, the Pitt River seeks to go beyond the relocation of a statue or an object in favor of a long-term process aimed at more fully recognizing, quote, the integral role of empire in British museums, end quote. A core strategy has been to foster co-curatorial initiatives of research and collaborations with artists and scholars with a stake in re-articulating the collection. And it was in this spirit that our proposal to organize an object-based workshop led by Professor Copeland was keenly embraced by the museum. In preparation for the event, Dr. Smith and I chose 5 categories of objects from the online database listing the Pitt Rivers Museum's holdings in African objects. This included rubber, herbs and healing substances, hair, souvenirs, and specimens. We then invited an intergenerational group of students and scholars to engage with a pre-established selection of items in each one of those categories, with the hope of testing and expanding the analytic possibilities of the Afrotrope. For us, the institution's labeling and cataloging processes allowed for a consideration of its imperial materialism. And in line with Copeland and Thompson's theorization, we understood the workshop as an opportunity to rethink the heuristic protocols that organize the art historical field, starting with its disciplinary boundaries. By linking the Art History Department of Oxford with the Ruskin School of Art and the Pitt Rivers, we had hoped to move beyond a set of disciplinary categories first drawn up within the context of the Enlightenment and still operative within the North Atlantic humanities. Indeed, while the emergence of visual culture departments in the 1990s, spearheaded by Black British scholars like Stuart Hall and Paul Gilory, posed significant challenge to this order, today, leading UK universities still maintain a rigid distinction between art history, fine arts, anthropology, and archaeology. Only in recent years, moreover, have art history departments in the UK begun to globalize their curricula by creating posts for scholars who specialize in the arts and visual cultures of all 5 continents, with Africa still pitifully underrepresented within this sector. To embrace the afrotrope as a methodology necessarily meant changing the state of affairs. Conceived partially in response to Gilory's call for new chronotopes of the Black Atlantic, the afrotrope offers art historians a way of reconfiguring the spatial coordinates of the discipline in terms of diasporic networks of exchange and circulation, in stark contrast with the regionalist focus of much scholarship in the field. We hoped that this prospect would prove as stimulating to students and fellow scholars as it was to us. From the user's guide, we culled together a series of questions, imagining that participants would have a common point of departure, but quickly move into different directions as guided by the object under consideration. And finally, our aim was to develop strategies that could facilitate a reframing of art history in terms of objects and images that have traditionally remained outside of the field's field of vision. Like the organizers of this conference, we hope to interrogate the cultural politics of museum collections and their repercussions on what and who counts as part of culture at any given time. Of course, our workshop never took place. We never did have the chance to fully explore these ideas. This presentation, then, is an opportunity for us to revisit and redevelop the conversations that we were having at the time of planning the event by honing in on one of the items that we hoped to engage with in a group: rubber. Our starting point for thinking about this material was a brief entry in the database of the Pitt Rivers Museum describing, quote, numerous small lumps of raw rubber stuck together, end quote. The object, if an assemblage of rubber lumps can be even called that, was marked by originating in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo. It was not illustrated by a thumbnail, nor was it on display inside the museum. Even without seeing it, however, we knew that it opened up suggestive possibilities for mapping out the work of the afrotrope. Emblematic of the workings of what Londa Shabinger has called the colonial bioprospecting or colonial biopiracy, the global rubber trade flourished in the year 1876 when Henry Rickham smuggled thousands of seeds of the Hevega brasiliensis, the Amazonian tree whose trunk releases the liquid latex from which hard rubber is made, and sold them to Kew Gardens, the largest botanical collection in the British Empire. From there, fresh seedlings were shipped for cultivation in today's India, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, Singapore, and Malaysia. Meanwhile, on the African continent, rubber cultivations were developed by different colonial administrations using both local trees and vines. From the onset, rubber was spoken of as a magical substance, the same way as much as plastics were in the 20th century. Its malleability was cause for amazement, as was its capacity to spring back into shape. Even more astounding was the fact that vulcanized rubber, sap that is treated with sulfur, retained flexibility when exposed to extreme cold and heat, a characteristic that implied endless commercial potential.
Evidence of the excitement that surrounded this technology can be found inside the archives of the Great Exhibition held at Crystal Palace in London in 1851. Significantly, the exhibition included an eclectic showcase of curiosities in vulcanized rubber. Black ebonite, a type of processed rubber that was said to resemble ebony, was used to produce exquisite items of jewelry, for example, including brooches and chains. Less elegant variations on the same technique were used to produce waterproof clothing, dinghies, gaskets, and myriad other spare parts designed to join up the mechanical infrastructure of the Industrial Revolution. Such was the perceived worth of this substance that upon visiting the exhibition, Queen Victoria was gifted a lump of rubber engraved with a poem by William Cowper, which celebrates the virtues of colonial capitalism. Trade is the golden girdle of the globe, goes one line. The same material eventually became associated with the freedoms of modernity, first in terms of mobility, provided by its use in tire production for bicycle and automobiles, and then later sexual freedom, offering means of birth control by the manufacturing of rubbers, cervical caps, and diaphragms. Behind the miracle of rubber, however, lied the horrors of so-called slaughter tapping across the colonized world. At the height of the 19th century boom in natural latex harvesting, the violence of this process was primarily associated with the indiscriminate maiming of tropical woodlands. Far less attention was paid to the exploitation of Black and indigenous populations, largely debt slaves and bounded labourers, tasked with extracting the milky substance for the imperial metropole. Catherine Yusuf has recently described such instances of inhuman proximity between Black subjects and the resources of the earth in terms of nodes of extraction of properties and personhood, a definition that goes a long way towards articulating the political and ecological implications that rubber still holds within Afro-diasporic cultural practices. Nowhere did the production of rubber result in greater atrocity than in the Belgian Congo, from where our mysterious lump presumably arrived. Between 1885 and 1908, King Leopold II sanctioned the mutilation and torture of millions of African workers in the plantations of what was then still the Congo Free State, and now DRC. Severed hands and feet became the stigmata associated with this period of so-called rubber terror. A caricature circulated by the British press in 1906 and shown here portrays the Belgian monarch as a monstrous rubber serpent coiled around an African version of the Laocoon, a mockery which suggests that the largest empire on the planet saw itself as above such instances of racialized violence. And yet in 1962, the British Guyanese artist Frank Bowling created a suite of paintings that conflate the plight of Congolese plantation workers with the legacy of British colonialism in his native country. Emblematic of this body of works is Beggar, an experimental portrait of a figure with mutilated limbs. Inspired by memories of the Afro-Guyanese and Indo-Guyanese mendicants that haunted Bowling's childhood, the painting was also meant to express solidarity with a rising Pan-African movement galvanized around the figure of Patrice Lumumba, the first Prime Minister of the Independent Republic of the Congo, whose toppling and execution in 1960 was regarded by many as an act of neocolonial aggression. The painting, in other words, looks to the colonial past in order to picture a horizon of potential history, whereby centuries of white supremacist violence are compressed and reassembled as part of an ongoing struggle for Black emancipation. By merging the figure of the Congolese rubber worker with the spectres of African slavery and South Asian indenture in the Anglophone Caribbean, and specifically in the Latin American context of British Guyana, Bowling also charted a transnational geography that maps onto the colonial trade in rubber, whilst putting pressure onto an exclusively Afrocentric conception of Blackness. A plant-based substance whose cultivation was initiated by native Mesoamerican populations and eventually taken up across the globe, rubber does indeed challenge the ethnic parameters of the afrotrope in potentially productive ways. At the same time, however, this material has undoubtedly figured as a central motif within African and Afro-diasporic art practices which have deliberately exploited its racialized connotations as a chromatically black substance and one whose manufacture is intimately tied to a transcontinental history of white supremacist violence. One might draw here on the work of the South African photographers Aneli Muholi, for example. A number of self-portraits created for the series Dark Lioness from 2017 feature the artist wearing stacks of rubber tires around her neck. South African audiences might recognize this as a reference to neck lacing, a horrific form of punishment that was meted out within Black communities to apartheid collaborators who would be forced to wear rubber tires filled with petrol before being publicly set alight. But read against the longer history of the colonial rubber industry, the same images appear to hold together multiple instances of anti-Blackness. This is why it might be useful to think of rubber as an afrotrope with the capacity of unlocking expansive historical dimensions. As Copeland and Thompson put it, afrotropes do not simply recur over time, but materialize and are about time, its passage and return, its negotiation or reconfiguration by African diasporic subjects.
One might also turn to the work of African-American artist David Hammons. Inner tubes and sheets of vulcanized rubber repeatedly feature in his practice as proxies for Afro hair and Black skin. Champ and Rubber Dread, both from 1989, are two examples of this. A pun on dreadlocks, the latter piece parodies the stereotypical representations of Blackness as menace, reframing the semiotics of rubber as an index of Black subjection. Indeed, Hammond's work is particularly useful for thinking about the atropophagic potential of the afrotrope as an appropriative strategy in which repetition and reclamation are equally at stake. Meanwhile, artist Willie Cole's repurposed assemblages of discarded shoes with rubber soles serves as a deliberate recoding of mass-produced goods to engage with the history of the African diaspora and pay homage to forms and cultures that the artist studies. Through his transformations, as seen in these examples, Cole seeks to reconnect these materials to their past, drawing out what he called the life force within each of the souls that he finds, rendering the cumulative surface of use and wear visible as it becomes a new form into and of itself. And through the efforts of Shakaya Booker, the significatory history of rubber is shredded and forcibly wrangled into new and seemingly ominous forms that reference the violence inherent in the manufacture and production of automobile tires. The vulva-like mass of bra attraction from 2001, pierced at top and protected at its center by a steel clit, not only references the Black body, but also suggests the shape of a futuristic seed pod, again conjuring up the generative potential of rubber as a substance that materializes the intersection between the biotic realm and Black subjecthood. In a way, the sculpture plays on the notion that rubber is a magically flexible material, but turns the alchemal fantasies of the colonial era into a confrontational play on the racialized logic of the fetish. One could go even further and suggest that in its recombinant qualities makes rubber especially suited to the operations of the afrotrope, though this is something that we'd like to open up to further exploration and speculation. And by proposing to rethink the social and aesthetic connotations of this material through the analytics of the afrotrope, we simply hope to initiate a rich line of inquiry that would make space for those forms of collective intelligence that Copeland and Thompson describe as vital in making the African diasporic histories and bringing them to light. There's something uniquely poetic about starting from a cluster of small rubber lumps stuck together in order to test how far this formless substance could be pushed in terms of its epistemological and pedagogical potential. Regrettably, however, we never saw the item. Even before it had become clear that the workshop would not go ahead, we were told that the Pitt Rivers would not be able to grant access to any object held in storage, and that we should confine our ambitions to the collections on display. Nor did a photographic reproduction of the lump exist. Its very inaccessibility became a source of critical reflection for us. Not only was the Colonial Archive confirmed as a site of concealment, but the decolonial ambitions of the museum were exposed in all of their limitations. In spite of the staff's genuine ambitions to open up the collection to more inclusive forms of engagement and critique, top-down protocols ultimately overrode alternative modes of participation. While our request to use the rubber lump as a teaching prop was denied on logistical grounds, with more contentious items such as the Afro hair samples collected under the pretext of scientific inquiry, the same response was framed in terms of political sensitivity. For us, these closures highlighted the pitfalls of countering colonial regimes of hypervisibility with blanket forms of removal that risk once again obfuscating the violent history of white settler colonialism. Thank you for your attention, and we look forward to your questions and continued discussion.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Welcome back, or if you're just joining us, welcome to our keynote conversation. We'd like to let our audience members know that following the conversation, we'll have 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. So please feel free to type your questions into the chat as we go along, and we'll do our best to address as many as we can directly with our speakers. For those just joining us, we do want to reintroduce our keynote speakers, Huey Copeland and Krista Thompson.
I'm delighted to welcome Huey and Krista today again. We already welcomed them earlier, but some might have joined right now. So please let me introduce Huey briefly before Levi will introduce Krista. So Huey Copeland is Andrew W. Mellon Professor at the Center for Advanced Studies in the Visual Arts and BFC Presidential Associate Professor of the History of Art at the University of Pennsylvania. An editor of October and a contributing editor of Art Forum, Copeland is the author of numerous publications addressing the imbrication of race and aesthetic in the modern visual field, including Bound to Appear, Art, Slavery, and the Site of Blackness in Multicultural America, published in 2013 by the University of Chicago Press. At present, he is completing 2 additional book projects in this vein. The anthology Black Modernisms, co-edited with Stephen Nelson, and a collection of his writings, interviews, and essays entitled Touched by the Mother on Black Men, the Aesthetic Field, and Other Feminist Horizons, 1966 until the present.
Thanks, Sarah. And I'd like to welcome Krista Thompson, who is the Mary Jane Crow Professor of Art History at Northwestern University in Chicago. She's the author of An Eye for the Tropics from 2006 and Shine, The Visual Economy of Light in African Diasporic Aesthetic Practice from 2015, which was the recipient of the Charles Rufus Maury Award for Distinguished Book in the History of Art from CAA. Thompson is the co-editor of En Masse, Carnival and Performance Art of the Caribbean from 2015. She and Huey Copeland are co-editors of an ongoing series of articles on Afrotropes published by Art Journal. Her articles have appeared in American Art, in Art Bulletin, Art Journal, Representations, The Drama Review, and Small Acts. Thompson is currently working on the manuscript, The Evidence of Things Not Captured, which examines notions of photographic absence, fugitivity, and disappearance in Jamaica, forthcoming from Duke University Press. And she's also writing Black Light, a manuscript about electronic light artist Tom Lloyd. Huey and Krista, thank you so much for being so present with us today and closely engaging with these really, different, brilliant panelists and presentations. So many pertinent questions have been raised, not only about, the critical aesthetic and historiographical potentials of Afrotropes, but also about this conference and our art world ecology. So we would love to hear from you about all of the above and more. And thank you again for joining.
Well, thank you so much. It really has been just such an incredible joy this morning to hear from so many brilliant artists, thinkers, activists around this idea, and to see how generative it is and how productive, and also the real care with which all of y'all have engaged with and mobilized the concept. I think that's really exciting and points us into some really compelling new directions for further Afrotropic study. And I think, a few things that have really been underlined for me in listening to presentations today is the fundamental ambivalence of the material and sensorial world when we think about the Black subject, the Black bodies, Black beings' position and relationship to them. So that something like rubber can be a site of incredible violence, but then it can also be remade and taken up as a property for artistic production. We can think about salt as something mobilized in Deborah Jack's work that recalls the history of enslaved exploitation to produce salt versus the way Patrice Cullors would mobilize salt as a kind of healing agent. So I think it really underlines that we can't stick to certain kinds of easy conceptual or material categories to say, oh, well, the sonic and the haptic over and against the visual in terms of creating spaces of autonomy for Black subject. I think it's really about understanding that the whole of the world is potentially anti-Black and posed against Black folks. And it becomes a question of how you take up and turn on those materials. And I think in blues talk, right, it's really alerting us to what happens when the turn is stopped or frozen and the trope becomes a sort of stereotype. And I think what we see in all these sort of presentation is a kind of continual turning, right? We need to take the next step to undo the sort of frozen nature of a certain kind of stereotype to open it on to other things. So I think it also, emphasizes that studying the Afrotrope is work that demands that we see the kinds of liabilities of all of these different turns and to try to orient ourselves to ones that lead to possibilities of Black liberation. And I think, as Krista alluded to, this is something that also we can think about in terms of abstraction. If we go back to the question that Maleka raised and to Adrian Edwards's fantastic work, if we think about, say, the history of the Black square, right, in 20th century art, and the way in which that's been taken up by any number of African diasporic practitioners, from Glenn Ligon to Ellen Gallagher, returning to this kind of foundational form of 20th century art to make it useful for Black representational ends, but also have the effect of emphasizing the way in which the history of modernism and of the Black square in and of itself is already deeply imbricated with questions of figuration and of racialization, right? So as many of y'all likely know, in 2015, on the 100th anniversary of Malevich's Black Square, painted in 1915, the Tretyakov Gallery in Russia, which owns it, did an X-ray to see what was underneath that painting, underneath this sort of Black surface, this great sign of the monochrome and of negation in 20th century art. And what's under there is a Russian version of a French joke written in 1898. And in that French cartoon from 1898, which was about lambasting the extent to which Impressionism and Neo-Impressionism had made things so unrecognizable, it was a cartoon that simply reproduced a Black square, or actually a Black rectangle. And the caption underneath it was, "Negroes fighting in a cave at night." And it's that joke that is underneath Malevich's Black Square in Russian, a portion of that joke, right? So something, I think what the Afrotrope allows us to sort of do and to understand is not only the kind of imbrication of modernism with these sort of racialized forms and reference, but it also demands that we put pressure on notions like abstraction versus figuration, the art versus the vernacular, right? And we're always trying to push against those boundaries to underline what they prevent us from seeing or in fact thinking. So having perhaps gone on for a little bit too long with my thoughts, now I just want to turn it over to Krista and to hear from you about your thinking around the Afrotrope and how it's shifted or expanded in light of the rich conversations we've been treated to today.
Well, I think one of the things that underlines to me some of my kind of early interest in the Afrotrope was almost trying to understand why particular images come to have a visual life, whereas kind of others don't get kind of taken up. So I really liked Elvan's sense of thinking about the biology and the notion of a kind of trope which is attracted. What is the thing that attracts it? Is it attracted like to water? Is it attracted to light? And so there's something about the attraction to these images that I think is always kind of at the heart of kind of afrotropic kind of methodologies. But there's always something about the way that that slips out of reach, the way that that search is always unfolding, that I also think is really kind of rich to think about. And so I think that, in an art history that can be really based on kind of tracing origins, provenance, that there's something that is kind of unknowable and opaque and fugitive in kind of how the Afrotrope works. And so a part of it is trying to map out and chart a kind of history and an understanding, but it's also leaving open this space for what remains kind of unknowable, and that there's something in resting in that space of openness that I think is really kind of fruitful. I also thought the talks today, again, going back to the notion of kind of layering, I liked kind of thinking further about these notions of embodiment, these notions of the kind of haptic and the sonic that come together with the visual. And again, I think it presses us to consider the ways that we might push the resources that we typically draw on within kind of art historical methodologies in order to kind of make sense of the links between and these turns that the Afrotrope kind of takes. I also liked Elvan's kind of sense of the kind of multiple diasporas. And so again, it's this kind of layering, right? So how do we think about Armenian and kind of African diasporic and Jamaican diasporic kind of turns, and why they become invested in a particular image, right? So I was really struck by the fact that it wasn't the caretaker image that is the image that is really taken up within the Jamaican context, which you would think has a certain kind of resonance, right? And so what is it with the particular photograph as it gets kind of reproduced? I've been thinking about this a lot too with all of the images related to George Floyd. We had the opportunity, I don't even know if I should describe it as an opportunity, but we did a road trip kind of in the height of the Black Lives kind of Matter movements earlier this year. And we're really struck by the way that a particular image of Floyd started to be kind of reproduced, and how in its reproduction, there was a particular silhouette that then comes to be formed. And that silhouette, again, the sense of like abstraction and openness, and what that translation to walls, to protest signs kind of created. And so I think too, one of the things opened up for me in the discussion is the sense of typography as another kind of Afrotrope. And yeah, and so again, Black Lives Matter and Blue's kind of comments too about the kind of fonts that are used within these particular campaigns just got me thinking of the layering of the text also as this additional mode to think about what kind of happens within different afrotropes and what might give them that life, that might give them this form that makes people, communities attracted to them at particular historical kind of moments. And, you know, going back to Blue's comments too about, you know, being wary of commodification as a sign of the trope. I think it's interesting that some of the images that become afrotropic really circulate across networks that are fueled by capitalism. And in other instances, they really circulate on different kind of registers altogether. And so, yeah, so I think that again, being attentive to these forms of absence that reside, that wait, that are a part of thinking about the afrotrope is about giving a certain space and a kind of methodological priority to the things that might not kind of take a visual life or might not do so for a while. And so I think it's just a very different, a different set of priorities than the thing that is immediately visual or the thing that immediately takes a visual or figurative form.
Yeah, precisely. That's so beautifully said, Krista. And I think, you know, I would just add to that, I think what you've outlined there, and I think what Amy and Julia's presentation so beautifully underlined is the radical inadequacy of art history's methods and protocols to actually engage with the full, messy, complex unfolding of African diasporic cultural production. And also, I think, underlines the way that even those tools of art historical analysis that we think as neutral are deeply larded with a certain kind of colonial history, right? So if we think about, you know, the way in which for centuries, people could look over and over again at Manet's Olympia and never see the Black maid, right? Who is a third of the canvas, right? So this discipline, which is apparently about close looking because of its own blindness in the face of racialized vision, cannot in fact see, right? So I think it's the afrotropic that helps us underline the kind of limitations solely of the visual and having this embodied materialist approach to what's gained, what's lost in transmission, and seeing those as part and parcel always of the ecology, that an individual instantiation of the afrotrope carries forward with it. And I think for me, and this is maybe to respond to Maleko's point, that it's about that being a kind of semiotic. I think it's yes, engage with the sort of notion of the semiotic, and I think you know, also Sarah's brilliant thinking about the dialogical and the dialectical image is totally resonant. But I think as someone who is you know, increasingly captivated and captated by the work of Karen Barad, who is a US-based queer feminist theoretical particle physicist, who is bringing kind of post-colonial performance studies into dialogue with quantum physics. It's really fantastic work, that she is able to help us see that we have this sort of division between, say, words and things, or objects and representations, or epistemology and ontology, when in fact those divisions are manufactured as exercises of power, and they actually don't speak to how being and knowledge unfold in an imbricated way in the actual world. So I think the afrotrope has spurred us to move for me at least, particularly to move away from the kind of semiotic post-structuralist mode of analysis in which I was trained, I think as many of us of a certain generation were, to instead have a much more capacious way of thinking about the relationship between matter and meaning and how they unfold. And the Afrotropic, I think, can become a really kind of key site or fulcrum that puts pressure not only on those assumptions and the business as usual of the field, but also the claims that we make about our work and what it says, right? So I think, you know, an Afrotropic analytic helps us to think, well, when X or Y institution says they're decolonizing Y or Z, what are they in fact doing, right? How do we sort of think about the way in which the rubber hits the road if we take this sort of tropic perspective to study the way in which certain thematics appear or don't, are suppressed or not engaged. So I think for me, what this is really underlined is that there's so much kind of more work that can continue to be done, I think, and thought in relationship to this concept. But I think maybe it would maybe make sense for us to be a little bit more granular and to speak a little bit more about some of the images that were key to us, if you want to advance those, Krista.
Do you want to discuss the first?
Yes. Okay. So what we're showing you now are two kind of images that were really central to our thinking about the Afrotrope before the Afrotrope was a thing we could think about. So the image on the right or on the left is one that the historian and art historian Marcus Wood has done fantastic work on. It's a representation of Anastasia of Brazil. It's a 19th century lithograph that became the locus of a whole ecology of imagistic and ritual practices in Brazil in the 1960s and 70s. So this image of a kind of insane constraint and violence then gets taken up decades, centuries later as this gathering site around which to articulate a kind of Afro-Brazilian identity and relationship to spirituality. And it was, I think, in engaging that work of Wood's in the context of our representation special issue from 2011, Perpetual Returns, New World Slavery and the Visual Imagination, that we really began to articulate what we saw the Afrotrope as sort of doing and enabling, particularly because in that context, we were looking at the runaway slave icon and sort of thinking about the differences between how it appears in Glenn Ligon's work versus Hank Willis Thomas's work versus Christopher Cozier's work. And so it was even there that we'd already sort of started to develop a kind of Afrotropic analytic without knowing it.
Right. The other kind of image was an image that was really key in a lot of my kind of early thinking of the Afrotrope. And this is the image of Huey P. Newton from 1967 that was taken by Blair Stamp. And this is an image that was really central in a visual fashioning of the Black Panther Party in Oakland, kind of at this particular moment. I always loved this kind of wicker chair. The wicker chair is actually based on a kind of Boston company called Wakefield and Haywood. And they started manufacturing these chairs in the 1950s. But they really become taken up and become from this kind of local manufacturing to this kind of site of imagining one's connection to a broader kind of African diasporic kind of legacy history, and this kind of sense of both the throne forming this central space for really imagining one's empowerment. The image always struck me because in my own work in the Bahamas, I found that very quickly this throne was also taken up within studio practices. And again, thinking of Janine's kind of work, thinking about posture and rest, there's something kind of about the way that this throne almost immediately becomes used almost in the absence of Newton. So Newton is arrested by 1968, and for his birthday celebration, the throne would actually appear without Newton, but it becomes this receptacle that people can fill. And more recently, Jeanette Ehlers and Levon Bell really took this up in their own kind of public monument, I Am Queen Mary, from 2018, in which the throne again becomes this site in which histories related to Queen Mary and kind of rebellions that are taking place within plantations in the Dutch in St. Croix and the Dutch Caribbean are kind of being taken up by this particular work. And I love it too, because it becomes this space where a kind of speculative history, where there aren't kind of visual representations of these women, that Ehlers and Bell actually create a digital, almost avatar of their body to kind of stand in for this history. And again, using the throne as this way of kind of taking up the seat and imagining being a part of this kind of historical legacy. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, and I think, go ahead, Krista.
No, so I just also want to point toward the fact that Ehlers and Bell, in the title saying I Am Queen Mary, are then inviting everyone to kind of occupy this kind of seat that has come to represent this way of connecting oneself to a past and to this kind of diasporic imaginary. And it points toward the I Am a Man poster that has been so kind of central in Huey's work too, in its title.
No, I think that's exactly spot on, Krista. And I think, two things come to mind is one, what happens when you start to develop a certain kind of afrotropic optic. So because of your work on that chair, I now see it everywhere. It has become kind of ubiquitous in terms of my scanning of the visual field. And I might not have never noticed before, or thought it was unremarked when I saw it in my aunt's sitting room or whatever. But really having to have this new kind of alertness to when and how and where it appears, which sort of changes and expands one's understanding of the conditions under which a kind of aesthetic encounter might unfold. And I also think it just really kind of underlines this sort of issue of surrogation, as we've talked about, as it's so sort of wonderfully theorized by Joseph Roach in Cities of the Dead, the ways in which certain kinds of objects become stand-ins or placeholders for the body, or bodies that are no longer present, as a way, in fact, of protecting those bodies from further scopic and physical violence, which I think precisely, if we can go to the next slide, Krista, is partially what's issue in the I Am a Man sign, which is a kind of taking up and reframing, right, of this famous "Am I not a man and a brother?" And then what we see in this work, this is Glenn Ligon's condition report, is a return to the I Am a Man sign, and particularly his own painting of it. So he does a painting of the I Am a Man sign in 1988, and in 2000, he sort of returns to it, has a conservator friend at MoMA look at it for him, and to see how the painting has aged, how it's been damaged, and to sort of make these prints, this condition report on the condition of that work, which, like the work itself, becomes a way of talking metaphorically through a process of surrogation about the conditions of Black manhood, however you define that, when at any given moment in time, whenever the work appears or the context that it circulates in. Can we have the next picture, Krista? So here I'm just sort of showing you the original quote unquote original painting that he made in 1998, which is on view at the National Gallery of Art. It has the same kinds of feel and dimensions of that placard carried up by those sanitation workers. But of course, now it's this beautiful, lush, singly authored object. Can we have the next image, Krista? So in kind of rethinking this, afrotropically, I think one of the things that's been exciting for me is to really return to and think about the sign's original appearance, its history, the conditions of the strike itself. And so what I'm showing you now is this very famous photograph taken by Ernest Withers, in 1968 outside of Claiborne Temple in Memphis. This was around the protests of the sanitation workers that were happening. Really went on for sort of 63 days. And of course, Martin Luther King Jr. would eventually end up coming to Memphis to try to help with the effort. And of course, days later, he would be assassinated in Memphis. So this image is sort of weighted with all this, these historical kind of conditions. And in turning to it, Ligon very much aimed to sort of index those conditions in the present and the question of what it might mean to sort of think about this question of Black masculinity now. But I think one of the things that's been really fascinating for me in looking at this history and looking at this work, Krista, if we can just advance a couple more, past that one, 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 next one. Great, so thank you. Oh, sorry, you just went one ahead. So one of the things that we can notice, right, if we actually look at the Ligon's painting and the posters side by side, is that they are not, in fact, exactly the same. Ligon hasn't exactly repeated that I am a man, right? In a way, you see that the original poster, I am a man. That's the line break. There's one line break. Ligon has made it 3 lines, I am a man. And so the A becomes this kind of, pendulous connection, connecting the I am and man statements that enables, at least in my original reading of this work, a certain kind of queering of it. But if one goes back to the archive, and Krista, we can go forward 2 now. Oh, and one more? Yeah, perfect. That's it right there. So if one actually goes back to the archive, what we see here is a version of the sign that's much less famous than the one enshrined by Withers that was in circulation, right? So this kind of underlines not only the kind of collectively authored notion of the afrotrope, since there are any number of people who claim to have invented the I am a man slogan for use by the sanitation workers. So to underline that that's not only sort of pinned down, hard to pin down, but the fact that it's hard to pin down is a manifestation of this kind of collective intelligence trying to make claims on not just manhood, but being, on humanity for anyone who would listen. And I think the way in which we sort of narrate art historically, right, usually teaches us to focus on the artwork, and the source, quote unquote, is ancillary. And I, initially looking at Ligon's painting, did the same thing. I was like, oh, the poster, that's just, that's like the Venus of Urbino for my Manet. Like, I don't really need to look at it carefully. But if in fact you look at the poster, the ecology in which it participated, the number of many different versions that were in circulation around the time it was made, one begins to realize that all the kinds of resonances, the logics of surrogation that Ligon's painting depends upon were already in circulation with the work from the very first. And I think, it's also important to realize that this kind of trope is something that we have to look at not only for what it reveals about a certain kind of history, but also what it conceals. If we can have the next one, Krista. So what I'm showing you now is Sharon Hayes's, a still of Sharon Hayes's 2005 ongoing performance in the near future, which is in many ways her attempt to reactivate prior moments of public speech and civil discord in the public sphere. So she takes this I am a man sign and walks out in sort of New York's street space with it herself. She's got her own iteration, but I think it productively, raises this question of race and gender. How do we think about manhood outside of a cis framework? How do we think about who might belong within the scope of that contention? And how do we think about the role of white allies, but more importantly, Black women, right, in the work of the strike, which that sign, I am a man, has tended to efface. So even as my research is trying to understand the many iterations of I am a man and how they were changed over time for different audiences and different contexts, I also am interested in what the focus on the I am a man sign prevents us from seeing, prevents us from thinking about and exploring. And one of the things that I was able to discover while in Memphis, exploring the archives that are available there, tremendous amount of material, was more information not only about the important role that Black women played in organizing the strike, but also the fact that the protests that emerged and led to an escalation of violence in the strike and the National Guard being called in was because there was a rumor that a Black female high school student had been killed, right? So that there's a way in which, even as we hold the Afrotrope up, we need to think about, particularly I think from a Black feminist and queer perspective, the other histories and modes and ways of being that are just as crucial that certain kinds of representation can obscure. So I think for me, it's about taking the kind of ambivalent possibility of this sign and thinking about what it both opens up and also what it forecloses, and how in thinking those things together, we actually can come up with a very different way of narrating, say, art of the 1960s and the sites and the players who mattered within it.
Fantastic, Huey.
Oh yeah, so we can just zip past.
Okay.
We can zip past these, there's just more.
Okay, I'll keep my comments brief because I want to make sure we have time to engage with some of the wonderful speakers today. But I do want to just give this example. It's probably the image that I've been using to think about the Afrotrope kind of most centrally. And so this is a photograph of a poster that circulated, and it pictures Jimmy Cliff, and it was a poster for an independent film called The Harder They Come, which was produced in 1972. The image would come to circulate widely within the Caribbean, within the UK, and within the US. And it really became this kind of key representation of a certain kind of rude boy masculinity that becomes really important within the 1970s. Interestingly, there were several images that were produced of this kind of photograph and that actually appear within the film itself. But again, I'm interested in terms of the afrotrope, why there are certain images that come to be taken up and not others. And so I'm always struck by the very kind of active kind of posture and the way that the figure's own dynamicism, like the dynamic posture that Cliff assumes is something that somehow activates the image itself. Importantly, the photograph was actually based on a kind of a real person who was wanted as a fugitive in the 1940s in Jamaica. And we're looking at this very kind of grainy representation of the person Ivanhoe Martin, who Cliff plays within the film. And interestingly, the story goes is that Martin is wanted by the police, and the police claim that they can't find a photograph of him, and that's why he's eluding their dragnet. And so Martin goes into a photo studio and has a photographs of himself taken, which he then demands be circulated to the newspapers. And so as it's elaborated within the film, the image itself is really about taunting the police and suggesting that the way that the photograph is linked to a certain kind of criminal capture, that Martin himself can continue to elude it. And so this is just a still from the film in which we see this graffiti kind of written on the landscape saying, "I was here, but I disappear." And I think our images might be cutting off a bit of the still, but you get the picture. And so a part of my work has just been trying to understand the relationship between this image, which seems like it is almost disappearing. And again, we can think about kind of blackness and shadow and the fugitivity of this image. And then this image of Martin, which seems to kind of highlight almost the performance of this figure, this tale of being able to elude the certain indexicality and association with criminality and the kind of repressive regimes of photography that become kind of associated with this figure. Of course, the image itself circulates in relationship to kind of reggae music and becomes central in the kind of popularity of reggae music around the world. Interestingly, thinking again about lyrics and music, this very different image, non-afrotropic image of Huey P. Newton would actually circulate with a lyric from The Harder They Come on it, showing again this kind of layering of these kind of different afrotropes that come together to really form this kind of representation, which is thinking about kind of Black liberation across different kind of Black geographies at this moment. And so, you know, the image would circulate on a book that was released after the film in 1980, would become a part of this kind of theatrical production, and you see the various kind of circulations and postures that become important in the image. And so, so I'm just showing these to show the way that these images really translate between and across media, and how the afrotropic is somehow coming to understand how that very kind of process of translation is really key to understanding, you know, how certain objects behave and how they're transformed kind of over time. And I'll just leave it there so that we can make sure that we have enough space for questions.
Fabulous. And I think, as we're waiting for the sort of questions to come in and for our co-panelists to visualize, I don't know if you want to maybe stop screen sharing, Krista, so that's a little easier. But I think, one of the things that we've often talked about, and you're actually very good on this, is, I'd say, well, the afrotrope. And you're like, no, afrotropes, underlining the kind of, we need to hold on to sort of the multiplicity of it. And I think, there's a way as part of this conversation today that I'm realizing, maybe we need to let go of afrotrope and afrotropes as nouns, as nominative objects, and really think about the afrotropic as an expanded field, pun intended, of and in a different method of art historical inquiry, rather than sort of tying it to the identification of the afrotropes, which I think is, as many of you have shown, still tremendously productive, but it's also the excitement, I think, of afrotropic thinking that can be brought to any number of cultural or art historical sites, like Malevich's Black Square or trap music, right?
Exactly, right. Which gets us out of this, it's not a kind of Afrocentricity, right?
Yes.
It's not a thing that people are holding out to be Afrocentric. It's a thing that people are identifying with that actually forms a type of community itself around which people identify.
Yes, no, completely. And I think, I agree. So I think we have questions coming in. And again, I would love for our fellow co-panelists to kind of join us for the conversation if they so choose.
This has been such an incredible day. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to Huey and Krista for that brilliant conversation, to our panelists for sticking with us and providing such rich critiques, and to our audience. Just thank you all, and really want to wish you a healthy and happy weekend.